The morning of June 6, 1944, arrived with an ominous stillness across the Normandy coast. At 5 o'clock, Oberleutnant zur See Walter Omsen stood in the observation post of the Crisbeck battery, his binoculars raised toward the pre-dawn darkness. His hands weren't quite steady as he swept the lenses across the water. What he saw in those first moments would never leave him. An image burned into his memory with terrible clarity. Through the gathering gloom, the impossible materialized before his eyes. The English Channel, that supposedly impenetrable shield protecting the Reich's western frontier, had become something else entirely. It had transformed into a steel highway, stretching from one horizon to the other, an endless procession of vessels pressing steadily toward shore. The invasion fleet numbered staggering proportions: 6,939 vessels in total, including 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 auxiliary craft, and 864 merchant ships. Over 195,000 naval personnel from 8 Allied nations manned these ships, sailing toward what they believed would be the beginning of the end. At 5:52 a.m., the order came through. Omsen's battery would open fire. 3 minutes later, at 5:55 a.m., the first shells screamed skyward from his 210mm Skoda cannons, arcing toward the approaching fleet. The projectiles seemed impossibly small against that vast armada, drops of water hurled at an oncoming tsunami. His battery targeted the American cruisers USS Tuscaloosa and USS Quincy, and the battleship USS Nevada. Within the hour, his gunners would claim the destroyer USS Corrie, the only American destroyer lost on D-Day itself. From his reinforced concrete nest overlooking the Kriegsbeck battery, the 32-year-old naval officer had just become the first German defender to spot and engage the Allied invasion of Fortress Europe. But what Omsen witnessed through his Zeiss rangefinder that morning transcended mere military engagement. Looking across the water, he saw something that contradicted every promise made by High Command. This wasn't just an invasion. It was the physical embodiment of industrial capacity that Nazi propaganda had repeatedly assured him simply didn't exist. The mathematics of defeat were approaching at 8 knots, and those mathematics were absolute. 50 miles inland, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. At Army Group B headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Oberstleutnant Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, received increasingly alarming reports throughout the night. Rommel himself remained absent in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced that the weather conditions made any invasion attempt impossible. At 1:20 a.m., notification arrived of massive parachute drops spreading across the Norman countryside. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, comprising over 13,000 men, were being transported in Douglas C-47 Skytrains. The implications were unmistakable. General der Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Army Corps from his headquarters in Saint-Lô, understood immediately what was unfolding. A veteran of the Eastern Front who had lost a leg at Stalingrad, Marx possessed tactical instincts honed razor-sharp by years of brutal combat. Yet even Marx, among the Wehrmacht's most experienced commanders, could not fully comprehend the scale of what was approaching. The German defenders had prepared for invasion. They had not prepared for an industrial avalanche that would bury them beneath sheer material superiority. Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruger, who had served as naval advisor to Rommel since November 1943, had spent months inspecting the coastal fortifications. Born into a naval family in 1894, he possessed deeper understanding of maritime operations than virtually any German officer serving in France. He had repeatedly urged more mines, more obstacles, more guns. Yet, as he would write later, reflecting on those fateful days, the fundamental problem remained unchanged. We were preparing to fight the previous war while they were bringing the next one. The German High Command had convinced itself that the Allies might manage an invasion with perhaps 20 divisions, supported by approximately 3,000 vessels. These estimates flowed from a dangerous assumption. They based calculations on their own capabilities, their own resources, their own experience of scarcity and industrial exhaustion after 5 years of continuous warfare. As dawn light began creeping across the Normandy landscape on June 6th, observers stationed in bunkers and fortified posts from Cherbourg to Le Havre began reporting something the High Command deemed impossible. not hundreds of ships. Not a raid or feint. Thousands of vessels, bringing the largest amphibious invasion in all of human history. At strongpoint WN-62, overlooking what would soon be known as Omaha Beach, Gefreiter Heinrich Sevelow peered through his machine gun positions at 5:45 a.m. The 20-year-old farm boy from Metzingen had never seen the ocean before being posted to Normandy. Now the ocean itself had vanished. In its place sat only steel and vessels in every direction. Ships everywhere, Sevelow would later record in his own account. Big ships, small ships, flat-bottomed craft, destroyers racing back and forth like herding dogs. The horizon was simply gone. I tried counting, but stopped at 100. Thousands more remained beyond measure. Across the entire 50-mile invasion front, German officers and soldiers experienced the same stunning recognition. They faced not merely superior numbers, but a fundamentally different magnitude of force entirely. At 5:30 a.m., the naval bombardment commenced with devastating intensity. The Allied fleet brought 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors to bear against the German positions. For the defenders, this represented their first brutal education in American industrial mathematics. The USS Texas alone discharged 255 rounds from her 14-inch guns in the opening hour. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds. In 60 minutes, a single ship had delivered 178 tons of explosive ordnance, more ammunition than many German artillery regiments possessed in their entire reserve stocks. Before even a single soldier set foot on the beaches, the Allied naval forces had already fired approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 shells from cruisers, and 3,500 shells from battleships. The total came to roughly 130,000 tons of explosive ordnance. General der Infantry Gunther Blumentritt, serving as Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief West, would later reflect on those devastating hours. We had prepared ourselves to fight soldiers. Instead, we found ourselves fighting factories. At 6 o'clock, as naval shells continued their relentless pulverization of the Atlantic Wall, the sky itself opened with the second demonstration of Allied industrial supremacy. Aircraft appeared in numbers that defied quick counting, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands. The Allies conducted over 14,000 sorties in direct support of the landings, having already achieved complete air superiority before the invasion commenced. The Luftwaffe possessed approximately 300 operational aircraft across all of France. On this single day, they managed 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. For every German plane airborne, 46 Allied aircraft pressed the advantage. The mathematics weren't merely unfavorable, they were grotesquely one-sided. Major Joseph Priller, commanding Jagdgeschwader 26, led the only Luftwaffe attack against the invasion beaches that morning. Accompanied solely by his wingman, Heinz Wodarczyk, he strafed Sword Beach once before fleeing from dozens of pursuing Allied fighters. This famous incident, recorded in numerous historical accounts, demonstrated the complete helplessness of German air power in the face of overwhelming Allied aviation strength. Despite the crushing firepower arrayed against them, certain German defensive positions initially harbored genuine hope. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division held excellent defensive terrain, occupying bluffs that commanded clear views of the beach approaches. Machine guns positioned in concrete fortifications created overlapping fields of fire that seemed, on paper at least, capable of inflicting catastrophic casualties. The first waves of American soldiers from the 1st and 29th Divisions walked directly into a bloodbath. When the Americans reached the beach at 6:30 a.m., machine gun fire erupted from multiple strongpoints. Heinrich Sevelow, manning his MG-42 at strongpoint 62, fired over 12,000 rounds throughout that morning, a documented figure from his own later testimony. He watched American soldiers fall by dozens, by hundreds. Bodies floated in the churning surf. The beach water turned deep red with blood. For a brief interval, it seemed the Atlantic Wall might actually hold. Then the destroyers arrived. At approximately 8 a.m., with the situation at Omaha Beach becoming critical and General Omar Bradley seriously considering evacuation, something unprecedented in this campaign, American destroyers made a decision that history would record. Ignoring the significant risks of grounding or hitting mines, they closed to within 1,000 yards of the beach itself. Point-blank range for naval artillery. The USS McCook, USS Carmick, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt turned their 5-inch guns directly on individual German strongpoints. At such distance, they couldn't possibly miss. This action, meticulously documented in naval records, proved decisive in breaking German defensive resistance at Omaha. This marked the moment when German officers truly began grasping the meaning of American industrial might. It wasn't merely the sheer number of vessels, it was something far more fundamental: the willingness to risk them, to use them as expendable assets in pursuit of victory. The destroyer USS Corrie was lost, but others immediately filled the gap. For the Kriegsmarine, ships were precious, irreplaceable assets. For America, they were tools, and America possessed thousands more. As morning progressed into afternoon, German observers witnessed phenomena that shattered their understanding of amphibious operations. The landing craft continued their procession, wave after wave, hour after hour, an endless conveyor belt of soldiers and equipment flowing from sea to shore in relentless succession. The variety of specialized vessels astonished German observers accustomed to simpler amphibious efforts. Landing craft tank vessels discharged 30-ton Sherman tanks directly onto the beaches. Landing ship tank vessels, massive 328-foot structures, beached themselves and opened their great doors to disgorge entire tank companies onto the sand. UKW amphibious trucks swam through the water, drove up the beach, and delivered supplies directly to combat units. By nightfall, the Allies had successfully landed approximately 156,000 troops, 132,515 by sea and 23,400 airborne. This single day's landing force exceeded the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. In those initial 24 hours, the documented Allied accomplishment included 156,000 personnel, 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and 15,000 tons of supplies. The German 7th Army defending the entire Normandy region possessed fewer than 500 operational tanks. The Allies had landed 3 times that number before the sun set on D-Day. The German response to the invasion revealed more than mere material inferiority. It exposed systematic breakdown in the face of overwhelming enemy capability. The legendary panzer divisions that had conquered France in just 6 weeks back in 1940 now found themselves paralyzed by Allied air supremacy and naval gunfire. The 21st Panzer Division, the sole armored unit positioned close enough to mount an intervention on D-Day, began its counterattack at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The division required 3 full hours to cover the 10-mile distance from Runville through Caen. What should have been a devastating armored thrust became a tragic procession of burning vehicles silhouetted against the smoke. When surviving panzers finally engaged British forces near Sword Beach, they encountered naval gunfire directed by forward observers positioned throughout the beachhead. HMS Warspite, maintaining watch from 15 miles offshore, fired 15-inch shells capable of penetrating any tank ever constructed. Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, would later write in his personal account, "The enemy's material superiority proved so overwhelming that our own strength was swept away like waves breaking against rock." By June 7th, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance aircraft returned with photographs that senior officers initially refused to believe. The Allies were constructing harbors, not capturing them, building them from nothing in open water. The Mulberry harbors represented industrial accomplishment on a scale that strained comprehension itself. Prefabricated across the Channel in Britain, these artificial ports comprised 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, 10 miles of floating roadways, and 93 ships deliberately sunk as breakwaters. Within 2 weeks, the Mulberry harbors were processing 9,000 tons of supplies daily, more capacity than many established French ports. The Germans had invested 4 years building the Atlantic Wall to protect conventional ports. The Allies had simply rendered ports unnecessary. Throughout June 1944, German commanders gradually confronted the totality of their intelligence failure. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate deception campaign, had convinced German intelligence that Normandy represented merely a diversion. The real invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, led by General George Patton commanding a fictitious 1st United States Army Group. For crucial weeks, German reserves remained frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that would never materialize. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding Panzer Group West, discovered the deception when captured documents revealed Patton's actual location in Normandy, commanding the very real Third Army. As June progressed into July, German officer reports to higher headquarters became increasingly frantic and desperate. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received a telephone call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at OKW, demanding explanation for why the invasion hadn't been hurled back into the sea. When Keitel posed the question of what needed to happen next, Rundstedt's response became legendary in its stark simplicity. "Make peace, you fools. What else is there left to do?" His unflinching candor came with an immediate price. Within moments, he found himself stripped of his command, removed from authority for daring to speak truth to power. A month earlier, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had stood face-to-face with Hitler on June 17th at Margaville in France. What Rommel laid out during that meeting wasn't rhetoric or wishful thinking, but cold mathematical reality. The statistics he presented painted a picture of absolute hopelessness. The Allies had achieved complete air supremacy over the battlefields. German divisions had been reduced to merely 30% of their authorized strength. Daylight movement had become essentially impossible because naval gunfire controlled every exposed road and position. Hitler's answer was characteristically uncompromising. No retreat would be permitted, only fanatical resistance would be tolerated. Rommel left that meeting carrying a certainty in his bones. Germany's fate was sealed. Within weeks, he would find himself entangled in the July 20th plot against Hitler's life and forced to swallow poison rather than face a show trial. Years after the fighting ended, Hans Speidel, who had served as Rommel's chief of staff and survived the conflict, set down his reflections in his book covering the Normandy campaign. His conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. We were not beaten by superior soldiers or cleverer tactics. We were simply buried underneath an overwhelming avalanche of material. The struggle for Caen became the perfect illustration of this brutal equation. On July 7th, more than 460 RAF heavy bombers unleashed their cargo across the city in just 40 minutes, dropping approximately 2,500 tons of explosives. The sheer tonnage of that single raid exceeded all the destructive power the entire German Luftwaffe possessed in the entire French theater. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, representing some of Germany's finest troops, had rolled into Normandy with roughly 20,500 men and 150 tanks standing ready for combat. 6 weeks of relentless fighting transformed that unit into a hollow shell. When the battle concluded, only about 300 soldiers remained fit for duty. Every single tank had been destroyed or abandoned. The Falaise pocket alone consumed 8,000 of their casualties in a matter of days. Operation Cobra, the American breakout commencing on July 25th, provided the final exclamation point on Allied material dominance. The sky literally darkened as 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers converged on a concentrated target zone measuring just 6,000 by 2,200 yards, releasing approximately 3,300 tons of ordnance in a relentless carpet bombing assault. General Panzer Lehr Division Commander Fritz Bayerlein stood in the rubble of his command post and spoke words that captured the incomprehensibility of what he was witnessing. "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." The Panzer Lehr Division had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and approximately 16,000 soldiers under arms. After the bombing, it essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 3,000 men positioned directly beneath the bombardment, roughly 1,000 perished instantly under the falling tonnage. Another 1,000 suffered serious wounds. The remaining 1,000 were so psychologically shattered that they had become useless as combat soldiers. The operation's own friendly fire incidents killed 111 American servicemen and wounded another 490, among them Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to fall in combat anywhere in the European theater. Yet despite these tragic losses among their own forces, the American command absorbed the casualties without hesitation, without altering the operation's momentum, without allowing it to affect the strategic objective. The Falaise Pocket, which persisted from August 12 through August 21, 1944, transformed into a charnel house for German military power in Normandy. The numbers tell a story of near-total destruction. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers lay dead across the Pocket's territory. Between 40,000 and 50,000 more were captured, their war effectively finished. The tally of destroyed armor reached 344 tanks and self-propelled guns in just the northern sector. More than 2,400 soft-skinned vehicles had been abandoned or destroyed. Over 250 artillery pieces were lost. Somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans managed to slip through the encirclement, but they escaped as disorganized remnants, as scattered fugitives, not as functioning military units capable of organized resistance. The officers commanding the German General Staff confronted a truth they struggled to accept. They were not losing a conventional military campaign. They were being processed through an industrial equation against which they possessed no defense. The production numbers from 1944 starkly illustrated the chasm that had opened between the contestants. Germany produced roughly 39,800 aircraft that year, with tank production reaching a peak monthly output of 1,154 units in December. Military truck production reached approximately 68,000 vehicles for the entire year. By contrast, American factories turned out 96,000 aircraft, 29,000 tanks, and 650,000 military trucks during that same 12-month period. These figures didn't even account for British, Canadian, or Soviet manufacturing capacity running in parallel. Germany was attempting to wage war against the combined industrial output of the entire world, while operating with the production capabilities of a medium-sized industrial nation, and even that capacity was steadily evaporating beneath relentless Allied bombing. The total American war production across the entire conflict included 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks, and roughly 41 billion rounds of ammunition. General Franz Halder, the former chief of Germany's General Staff, performed the calculations after the war's conclusion. By 1944, he determined the Allied advantage in overall war production had reached approximately 5-1. In specific categories like military vehicles, the advantage climbed to 10-1. His final assessment carried the weight of historical clarity. We were not defeated, we were mathematically eliminated. The German officers who came through Normandy carried psychological scars that went far beyond mere military defeat. They had witnessed something more profound, more corrosive. They had watched the complete dismantling of Nazi ideology regarding German racial and cultural superiority and corresponding American decadence and weakness. Young officers who had absorbed Nazi doctrine their entire lives discovered they had been fed systematic lies about American capacity and will. They had been indoctrinated that Americans were soft, corrupted by comfort, incapable of genuine combat. What they encountered instead was an enemy that deployed machines to perform the grueling work, that used radios to achieve perfect coordination across vast distances, that possessed ammunition in such abundance that soldiers could train and practice constantly, that seemed backed by an industrial system of genuinely unlimited capacity. The psychological toll proved devastating. Suicide among German officers spiked upward dramatically in the months following Normandy. The loss of military position was one thing. The shattering of their entire worldview, the recognition that nearly everything they had been told about the world was fundamentally false, proved spiritually corrosive in ways that mere battlefield defeat could never achieve. The gulf between perception and reality had opened up and swallowed their certainties. Beyond the mere question of quantity, German officers had to confront a technological gap that revealed how desperately far behind Germany had fallen in the race for military innovation. Proximity fuses transformed anti-aircraft fire from desperate harassment into a form of precision killing. Radar-directed naval gunfire could strike targets miles inland with devastating accuracy on first round. The specialized amphibious trucks solved logistical problems that German planners literally could not conceptualize from within their own industrial framework. The array of specialized Allied vehicles particularly struck German officers with their ingenuity. Hobart's specialized tanks, radically modified for specific purposes like mine clearance, obstacle destruction, and bunker elimination, solved tactical obstacles through engineering innovation rather than through expenditure of human blood. The entire approach reflected a philosophy German military culture simply did not share. Throughout the Normandy campaign, German officers developed an almost primal fear of naval gunfire directed from the sea. The battleship HMS Rodney's massive 16-inch guns could lob their shells approximately 23 miles inland with devastating effect. The American battleships Nevada and Texas, alongside HMS Warspite, transformed their main batteries into super-heavy artillery platforms capable of reducing any land target to rubble, regardless of fortification or concealment. When German artillery units attempted counter-battery fire against these floating fortresses, they learned the fundamental futility of their efforts. The ships could move. The ships could return fire. The comparison was not even remotely competitive. By mid-July 1944, daylight movement for German forces had become virtually suicidal. Allied fighter bombers, operating in coordinated groups controlled by forward air controllers, positioned with ground units, could respond to any target within minutes. The arithmetic of air superiority was almost contemptuous in its lopsidedness. Over 12,000 Allied aircraft were operational within the Normandy theatre at any given time. German fighter strength in that same area numbered between 300 and 500 aircraft. Allied sorties averaged between 5,000 and 8,000 daily. German pilots, when they could fly at all, managed perhaps 50 to 100 sorties on their best days. The Normandy campaign's final accounting tells the complete story of industrial warfare unleashed. From June 6 through August 30, 1944, the Allies landed approximately 2.6 million personnel on the beaches and beyond. They moved ashore 438,471 vehicles of all descriptions. Supply deliveries reached nearly 4 million tons. Allied aircraft flew more than 480,000 sorties during the campaign. German casualties in Normandy totaled 240,000 dead and another 200,000 captured or missing. Tank and assault gun losses reached 2,200 vehicles. Entire divisions, more than 40 of them, were destroyed beyond recovery. By 1954, a full decade after D-Day, surviving German officers convened in Bonn for a private symposium dedicated to examining the Normandy experience and drawing lessons from it. General Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and other senior commanders during the fighting, stepped forward to deliver the keynote address. His words captured something the attendees had spent a decade trying to articulate to themselves. War changed fundamentally in Normandy, he told the gathered audience. It became something far different from what we thought it was. It was no longer a contest between armies operating under similar constraints. It became a confrontation between economic systems themselves. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured success through courage while they measured it through production capacity. The image that still visits me in quiet moments is quite simple. It was watching American bulldozers mechanically push aside our destroyed tanks, clearing the roads to make way for their supply trucks, passing through continuously. That single image, repeated countless times across Normandy, captured the entire dynamic of the war. The German officers who experienced D-Day personally underwent a fundamental transformation from that point forward. Hans Speidel eventually became a NATO general, working to integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance structure and European security frameworks. Many of the Normandy veterans became advocates for European economic unity and integration, having learned viscerally that only through pooling resources could European nations hope to approach American productive capacity. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who commanded German forces in the Mediterranean theater, reflected on the difference in his own experience. In Italy, he reflected, we could fight the Allies on something approaching equal terms. But in Normandy, when they could deploy themselves across open ground and utilize their full industrial might, our forces were simply erased from the map. On June 6, 1984, Exactly 40 years after the initial landings, Walter Ormson, the former observation officer who had witnessed the invasion fleet from his coastal position, returned to his old battery location as an honored guest. Now 73 years old, the former Oberleutnant stood at the same observation post where he had first seen the invasion armada approaching the horizon. Speaking to the gathered crowd of veterans from both Allied and German forces, his reflection carried the weight of 4 decades of reflection and historical perspective. 40 years ago, I stood exactly where I am standing now, and I saw something I still have difficulty believing, he began. The channel was absolutely covered with ships from horizon to horizon. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations do not build 7,000 ships. Divided nations do not coordinate an invasion of this magnitude. I fired my guns at that armada with everything we could deliver. But I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide. Of every 100 ships that sailed past our position, perhaps 1 was hit or damaged by our fire. 99 more came safely through. Young military officers today study Normandy in their tactical courses, he continued. But the real lesson is far simpler than tactics or strategy. In modern warfare, the side that can produce the most wins. Industrial capacity is military capacity. The sea of ships I watched that morning was not merely an invasion fleet arriving to attack a beachhead. It was American industrial might made visible, made concrete, made impossible to deny. The German officers who watched nearly 7,000 Allied vessels approach on that June morning witnessed more than a military invasion. They witnessed a fundamental shift in what warfare meant and could mean. They saw industrial capacity made physical, materialized into ships and vehicles and ammunition and all the apparatus of total war. They confronted the full weight of democracy's latent power when that power was finally mobilized and applied to military purpose on a scale that rendered traditional military virtues almost irrelevant. They had trained for conventional warfare. They encountered instead the full force of American industrial capacity. The German officers watching those ships understood in that moment of terrible clarity what they were witnessing. They were seeing the end of military warfare as they had learned it in academies and through decades of professional service. They were seeing the birth of something entirely new. Industrial warfare on a scale and with an intensity that made their professional expertise and hard-won knowledge essentially obsolete. Their ultimate defeat was not a military failure in the traditional sense. It was not a tactical miscalculation. It was not a failure of personal courage or unit cohesion. It was a shortage of trucks. It was an arithmetic that could not be argued with or overcome through determination. It was a lesson written indelibly in steel across the waters of the English Channel on June 6, 1944, when nearly 7,000 ships announced to the world that American industrial might had arrived in Europe. That arrival changed everything. Nothing would ever be quite the same again.